Michèle at Jasami Bookworm Podcast. I know everyone is sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for part 2 about Oscar Slater with our most welcome guest, Judith Bowers. Welcome, Judith.
Hello and good evening, Michèle. How are you?
I'm wonderful and excited, as I know all of our audience is, to hear the second part. You are such a phenomenal storyteller. So please continue with the story. Now, we left off at Oscar Slater being identified, and there was questions about that. So please continue.
Well, Oscar Slater claimed that he was innocent, and he basically put his faith in the British justice system, particularly the Scottish justice system, and he voluntarily came back to Glasgow after being picked up by Pinkerton's men in New York and being identified, wrongly or rightly, who knows, by Mary Barrowman, the messenger girl, Nellie Lambie, the maid, and Arthur Adams, the downstairs neighbour of Miss Marion Gilchrist. And he came back to Glasgow, obviously, under arrest. But then everything really started to go really badly wrong for him. I mean, first of all, everything was prejudiced against him. And the reason why everything was prejudiced against him was, we're talking 1908 here. There was a lot of bad feeling about Germany, because we're just pre-World War I. And there was also a lot of bad feeling about the Jewish community. And Oscar Slater was both German and Jewish.
Double whammy.
So that didn't really go very well for him at all. Also, he was already, of course, known to the Glasgow police. He'd already been arrested several times for his illegal card games. He was well known for living with a known prostitute, Madame Junio, or Antoine Junio. So, yes, everything seemed to be against him. And when he went into court, when he was finally in court, and the trial was presided over by Lord Guthrie, the first thing that is really notable about the trial is that he wasn't allowed to say one word in his own defence.
But I thought that was a right, that you could present yourself.
It is now. And I think it was then as well, to be fair. But of course, this was by this time 1909 and prejudice against him. And it seems that the excuse for him not actually being able to speak for himself was because the judge thought, and his lawyers believed, that his heavy German accent would prejudice the jury against him.
That would be my question, was who was defending him and why they took that stance.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? They were basically allegedly saying that it was for his own interest. I mean, I have no record of who his actual lawyers were. All I can say is that, Lord Guthrie himself seemed to feel that he would be prejudicing the jury against him, prejudicing the media against him, because, of course, the media were there as well. It was a big trial because of Marion Gilchrist being 82 years old, brutally murdered in the most horrendous way, not in a poor East End close, but in a well-to-do West End household. She was well known, she was very wealthy. Diamond brooch was stolen. They decided that because he was a jewellery dealer, it was likely him that stole the diamond brooch. They actually did have a pawn ticket. They found a pawn ticket on Oscar Slater as evidence, and they brought it to the trial as evidence that he was the one that stole the diamond brooch.
But what was the pawn ticket for?
A diamond ring.
A ring, not a brooch, but
that was never mentioned, though. They just brought forward the pawn ticket and said, this is the pawn ticket that was pawned at the time of Marion Gilchrist's murder on Sauchiehall Street.
So it could have been for anything, and they didn't give him the opportunity.
And this was all to do with the fact that there was a witness, Alan McLean, who claimed that Oscar Slater had tried to sell him a pawn ticket for the brooch at his club on the night of the murder.
So he assumed it was that it was for the brooch, but he didn't know.
Or was it true at all? Did Oscar Slater even attempt to sell the pawn ticket to Alan McLean, or was it something that was invented by the Glasgow police to throw suspicion in Oscar Slater's direction?
In order to have a quick close to the case.
Yeah, because the Glasgow police were under a lot of pressure. First of all, people were so outraged, the public was so outraged by the murder that they desperately wanted to see a resolution. They desperately wanted to see a victim. They desperately wanted to see the police doing their job and catching their man. But the thing was, it was fairly obvious that they were fudging evidence, even though forensics were available at that time. Basic forensic science, but it was basically invented in Glasgow by the Glasgow police. So they knew about fingerprinting.
Yes.
There was fingerprints available. Fingerprints were taken. As we discussed previously, John Thompson Trench, the lieutenant inspector who was the first detective on the scene, he identified the murder weapon. He saw the murder weapon. He saw the fingerprints. The fingerprints were taken. But that murder weapon, the dining room chair, was never mentioned again.
How can they... I've heard about hiding evidence and, when they wanted to blame someone, hiding things. But that's really a large piece of it.
It is. I mean, they used the hand hammer that they found in Oscar's house when they searched it after Oscar had fled. And they actually brought that to the trial and identified the rust spots on the hand hammer as blood stains.
A hammer would leave an entirely different imprint than a leg of a chair would.
Yeah, exactly. But they didn't really care about that. They weren't really bothered about that. They just wanted to make sure that Oscar Slater was found guilty.
And since he was, he lived a life of ill repute.
He did.
It was
perfect patsy.
Perfect patsy.
Perfect patsy for them. And that's what they wanted. They needed a perfect patsy. And on the actual day of the summing up of the trial in May 1909, he was convicted by a majority of 9-6.
So not everyone believed it.
No, not everybody believed it. There was 5 not proven and 1 not guilty.
So if it would have been just a little bit on the other side, not proven, it would have been an entirely different story for him and his life.
Yeah, and they even brought up, and I think a lot of it's to do with the fact that a lot of the people, the jury themselves, a lot of the jurors, they didn't really believe a lot of the evidence was coming forward, particularly since Oscar wasn't allowed to speak for himself. And also the fact that the written confession that was brought forward wasn't even signed by Oscar Slater.
There was a written confession?
There was, yeah. And we believe that it wasn't, when I've spoken to experts about this, that confession was not signed by Oscar either. And the reason why we say that is because many years ago, before the actual, well, not many years ago, but before the trial, or before the murder case itself, many years ago to us, Oscar Slater had been in this very building in the Panopticon, and he'd visited the attic freak show.
Really?
Really.
Oh.
Really. So in one of his very first visits to Glasgow, possibly before he actually moved to Glasgow, because we know that he maybe came up and down, did a little bit of jewellery dealing, possibly, we don't know. But there certainly is a postcard that he bought in here of the Peckham fat boy who was exhibited upstairs in 1908. And on this postcard of the Peckham fat boy, he has drawn a tattoo which Oscar Slater himself has. And on the back, he's written it to his friend Helen, I think her name was Helen, and he's written this lovely postcard saying, "Soon I'll be like this chap on the other side," referring to the Peckham fat boy. So obviously he was doing some kind of deal that was going to make him rich, and he was going to have plenty of food to be like the Peckham fat boy. That's what's implied. But the signature on that postcard from Oscar Slater is nothing like the signature on the written confession.
Another part of forensics that people decided to overlook.
Yeah, well, I think it's a case of they just basically falsified his signature, forged his signature on the confession. They didn't allow him to sign his own confession. But this never came about. Nobody ever knew about this because nobody had seen Oscar Slater's signature. We only know about it because of the fact that a friend of mine actually had this postcard.
Well, they could have done it at the time, when they had the signed confession, just had him sign something as well and done a comparison. So they were really focused on him to get this case closed. He was a perfect patsy because of the lifestyle.
He was.
So where do we go from there?
So basically he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. He was sentenced to death. In fact, I love the fact that the Glasgow Herald the following day came up with one of the best headlines I have ever heard in my life. They actually led the story with, "This trial has cast a lurid light in the dark places of our great city, in which such wretches apply their calling, a brood of alien vampires lost to conscience and shame, crawling in the black depths and basements of civilized society."
There's no part of drama about that, is there?
No. Yes, it's very sympathetic to Oscar Slater. He's an alien vampire. An alien vampire. I love that. They really don't write newspaper headlines like that anymore, do they?
No,
they really don't.
It's a shame because they've got so much material to work with nowadays, especially.
Exactly. But the thing is, not everybody believed that Oscar Slater was indeed guilty. In fact, his lawyers started a petition for his innocence.
Oh.
Which was signed by 20,000 people in Glasgow.
Oh my gosh, how did they do that?
They just circulated it. They circulated around the place. They gathered 20,000 petitions, signatures, and then they actually sent the petition in to get his sentence basically commuted. And so it was sent to the Secretary of State, for Scotland. I'm going to say that again. So the Secretary of State for Scotland, who was Lord Pentland at the time, he issued a conditional pardon on the strength of these 20,000 signatures, and he commuted the sentence from execution to life imprisonment. I know.
I don't know which is worse.
I know. Yeah, and he got sent to Peterhead Prison.
Oh, which was not a very pleasant place from what I understand.
No, I mean, prison in those days didn't involve snooker halls, television, internet, and a kettle in your own cell. This is in the days when a prison was seriously a prison. And you would have thought, let him go to prison, let's forget about him. But this case really stank. It really stank. Not everybody really believed what was going on, and a lot of people saw there was a lot of injustice going on here. And that's when the criminologist William Ruffhead, he actually published a little pamphlet. It's just a little pamphlet, but it's called The Trial of Oscar Slater, which you can actually get in the Mitchell Library if you ever want to read it. It's fantastic. I read it. And it highlights the case itself, the imperfections in the case itself, and the circumstantial evidence against Oscar Slater, basically the invented evidence against Oscar Slater. How they basically said, he'd flown from justice, and that had indicated that he was guilty. It proved his guilt, and the hammer and all this kind of stuff. And the fact that the one person that did know about the case, Lieutenant Detective John Thompson Trench, he was sacked. He was dismissed, and this was an award-winning detective. So, he put all of this together. He wrote this pamphlet. That pamphlet was read by one of the most famous authors in the world.
Who would that be?
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
One of my favorites.
And of course, Conan Doyle was very much about injustice. He'd already campaigned on a previous case, I think a year or so earlier, the Adalji case, about a half Indian lawyer who had been accused of the mutilation of a number of horses.
Oh.
Yeah. And Arthur Conan Doyle, after Adalji had been arrested, and put into prison pointed out that the horse mutilations still continued. So it couldn't have been Adalji because
Logic.
he was in prison.
He can't be doing it.
Exactly. It wasn't a fair, unless of course he was breaking out in the middle of the night, going and mutilating horses, then breaking back into prison again the next day. And I think that's when the Criminal Injustice Act came in, because, or the Criminal Appeal Act rather, that was partly encouraged by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's one of the great things that Arthur Conan Doyle did, was he did a lot to reform the justice of the time, which was pretty unjust, particularly if you were foreigner or poor or, you know, just not middle class and white. You know, it was the way it was. So it was, yeah. So he got involved. But Arthur Conan Doyle's involvement got interrupted with the First World War.
Oh, yeah, that was kind of a little incident in history.
Yeah, kind of got in the way of any proceedings going on with Oscar Slater and any kind of campaign to have him freed from prison. And although Arthur Conan Doyle was also working to free Oscar Slater, I can't say that he particularly liked Oscar Slater. Again, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a pamphlet about the case of Oscar Slater, and he discovered a lot of things about Oscar Slater. He really didn't like the man. He thought he was sleazy, slimy, definitely a criminal, but not guilty of the murder. Exactly, particularly not the murder of Marion Gilchrist. He was actually being pursued as well for to do with another case in New York, to do with another murder, but that was never proven, that was never discussed, that was never brought up, and also the fact that his name wasn't actually Oscar Slater.
What was his name?
We believe he arrived in the UK under the name Otto Sandman.
So he kept the initials, as people want to do sometimes.
Yeah.
But changed it. So what happened? Do we know anything about the murder in New York? Was that affiliated with him at all?
I've never found out anything further than the fact that so he was associated with another murder. Potentially he was wanted for questioning in another murder that happened in New York, in the apartment building that he'd been staying in New York a bit earlier, a few months earlier, a year earlier, I don't know. But there's no more details about that either. But I believe he was Otto Sandman at that point in New York. So he was also known to the New York police as well as to the Scottish police, the Glasgow police.
And what about the German police?
I don't know about that. I think he'd left Germany a good few years earlier.
So he had kind of an unknown history, but whenever he landed in a new country, the police quickly became aware of him because of
And he certainly lived in London before he moved to Glasgow. And Arthur Conan Doyle researched basically as much as he possibly could about the man. And I think he found out all of this information himself. And so did Lord Ruffhead. I mean, Lord Ruffhead also mentions bits and pieces about Otto Sandman / Oscar Slater. So everything does make him look like a guilty man. But
other than the evidence
that was fudged against him. Even Nellie Lambie's statement is a bit bizarre, because she actually says that when she's confronted with Oscar Slater and she had been coached, she does say that's him. But then later she denies that it's him. In fact, Oscar Slater had a very, very good alibi. He was actually in his flat at the time of Marion Gilchrist's murder with an illegal card game going on.
So there would have been several people that probably would not have wanted to come forward.
Well, one person that came forward was actually a man called Mr. McBrain, who had a grocer's shop in Sauchiehall Street. And he had actually gone to pick up money from Oscar Slater on an invoice that was due, and found Oscar Slater in. So we do know that he had a good alibi, that he possibly wasn't at Marion Gilchrist that night. And Nellie had stated that she didn't recognise him later on. She said he didn't know Marion Gilchrist. So she first says that's him after being coached on the journey over. Then she denies that he's ever met Marion Gilchrist. And then, in later years, Nellie Lambie actually spoke to the writer and of detective novels, Edgar Wallace.
Oh, I know him.
Yes, Edgar Wallace. Now, this is a little known fact. And he apparently, at the time, was interested in the Oscar Slater case later on. And Nellie actually stated to Edgar Wallace that he had visited Marion Gilchrist.
Oh. So that's where it came from, the earlier episode we did in part 1 when we said the Pinocchio knows about whether he knew her or not.
Exactly.
He may have known her. But again, that doesn't prove that he killed her.
Exactly. I mean, it seems that he was interested in her jewellery. Because she had a significant amount of jewellery. And like I say, that
in
diamond
the curtains.
crescent. Yeah. And she had it sewn into the curtains. And of course, the diamond crescent brooch, or the diamond brooch in the shape of a crescent moon, that was, it was well drawn. They did describe it. There is an illustration of it in the records. Did Oscar Slater actually buy this brooch off of Marion? Did he later pawn it? Was the whole story from Alan MacLean actually true? Who knows? But certainly Arthur Conan Doyle was convinced that whatever the case with Oscar Slater, stroke Otto Sandman, he was definitely innocent of the crime of murder. And although World War I got in the way, eventually Conan Doyle got him off on a technicality.
Oh, what was that?
That he had served 19 years in prison by this point, and in Scotland it was only 15 years for a life sentence.
Oh my gosh. So he did serve his time plus 4 years and then got out.
Yes, and he did receive a payment.
Oh, did he really?
He did receive a payment. I think it was about £6,000, something like that.
That would have been a huge amount back then.
Yeah. And then he moved to Ayr. and set up a bakery.
He set up a bakery.
Yeah.
He left the jewelry industry, probably feeling it would be better health-wise.
Probably.
So about how old would he have been about this time, Judith?
I don't know, but it would have been a fair age because, I mean, he would have been in his 30s at the time of the case. He was released from prison in about 1948, something like that.
48.
No,
that
48, that's too late. No, he died in 1948, I think.
Oh, okay.
Did he die in 48? Hold on a minute. Let's go back and check a few details.
Let's check the details. I love it when we do on-the-spot verification of details.
Yeah, he did. He died in 1948.
So it was just... So he went through two world wars.
Yeah. And he was born in 1872. Apparently, he was born in January 1872 and died in January of 1948.
So he, by the time, if he went to prison in 1909, and it would have been 10, 16 years, about 1925 or so when he got out.
Something like that.
So he would have lived about 20-something years as a free man.
Yeah, he definitely had a good bit of time as a free man. And I think he married again, actually.
Did he change his name from Oscar Slater to leave his past behind?
Yeah, I think he did. I don't know what he changed his name to, but I think he did change his name.
He almost would have to.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you couldn't... I don't think that he lived under the name Otto Sandman either.
So did he have a relationship, do you know, with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle afterwards?
No.
Or was it once he, kind of investigated and got him free out, since he should have been out anyway, because of how Conan Doyle felt about him, there wouldn't have been a relationship anyway?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Arthur Conan Doyle thought he was a really sleazy, horrible man. Whether or not his time in prison affected him, I don't know. But certainly we do know that he did marry when he got out of prison. He married a Scottish woman of German descent.
Ah, okay.
And that's when he settled in Ayr, I think, at that point. And I believe that he actually stayed in Ayr during the war. I don't think he actually joined World War II at all.
With his age, probably not. He might not have had the easiest life, though, once again, being German.
No, I think actually at the beginning of World War II, he was actually interned again for a while. Because of being a German Jew, I think, along with his wife. But you'd have to check the information on that.
That's another reason to go visit the Michèle Library, which is what we love to give our audience the opportunity to do, because the library contains so much wonderful historical details.
Oh, it does.
And the internet, yes, it's wonderful and convenient, but there's nothing like going to the library and actually holding that document, the pamphlet that was written, holding that in your hand, because you're actually holding a piece of history.
Oh, they're amazing. I mean, the language is a little bit Victorian. I have to say Arthur Conan Doyle's one is much easier to read because I love Arthur Conan Doyle's writing style anyway. It's fantastic. The Roughhead one, it's a little bit laborious, but yeah, it's always worth reading these things. It really is, and it is a fantastic story. I just wish I'd brought my notes with me today.
Well, you know so much even without any notes or anything like that, because you're what you know is integral to who you are, as a historian. And
I do love the story, though, I have to say, because it's a story that has embedded itself in Glasgow culture and history. In fact, after the case itself, his name, Oscar Slater, became slang for "see you later."
Oh,
yeah.
Really?
Yeah. See you, Oscar, or Oscar Slater, see you later.
Oh my gosh.
I
See
know.
these little bits.
It's not just the Cockneys that have rhyming slang. We Gees have it too, And the other thing about the case is, for a while, I don't know if they still do it, but certainly when I first started doing the Victorian Square Mile of Murder back in 1991 as a walking tour, they were still using it as in training police officers how not to use evidence.
And how not to proceed investigating a case.
Exactly.
And for your further information, Judith has a lovely series that is on YouTube. What's it called again? People's History?
Oh, the People's History Show. Yeah, actually, I think I talk about the Victorian Square Mile of Murder in that.
Yes, you do, because I remember Oscar Slater was mentioned in that. Actually, I think the two Jessies were, which we're going to follow up on that. But just to kind of wrap up about Oscar Slater, we'll say you have to put, for the People's History, you need to put Judith's name in there to get her actual videos, which is wonderful, always interesting. And you get to see the beauty of Judith. And
They're quite a few years old now. I was a lot younger.
Oh, just a little bit. It's like we're both just a little bit older. How many decades? But that's the interesting part, is learning about history and knowing that it never dies, and it does repeat itself. When there are stories of injustice that do come through. I think the Square Mile of Murder that we're wrapping up, the 4 stories, do come to show that in a very small area of Glasgow, historically, what does happen from, starting with the poisoning, then with the 2 Jessies, with Oscar Slater, and I know I'm leaving it.
Yeah, Dr. Edward William Pritchard,
Yes.
the man who murdered his wife and his mother-in-law.
Yes, he was the one, I know, he was the ugly one, that's why I wanted to forget him.
Oh, please, listeners, you must look up Dr. Edward William Pritchard on Google Images, and you will see what a gorgeous man he was. He certainly thought he was gorgeous anyway, because he handed out photographs to any woman that took his eye.
I couldn't believe they didn't wear dark glasses all the time anyway.
I think a blindfold would be the only way that... I suppose everyone's gorgeous in a blackout, certainly.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's very true. It would have to be. Well, I think that Oscar Slater definitely had led a challenging life, and the life he had and led did kind of contribute to what happened to him. But also, the fact that he was German, the fact that he was Jewish didn't help it. Those circumstances could not, he couldn't change those. So it is, it's a lesson in life that there are certain things, the life we lead, but who we are actually leads into the life, we end up with. So Having said that, I think each and every story from the Square Mile of Murder is a lesson for everyone. I think also that our audience should go and investigate a little bit more into each one of them for further details at the Mitchell Library. But in the meantime, I wish to thank you so much, Judith, because it's always a learning lesson, and it's always such a pleasure because it's history and it's learning, but you tell a great story, so we absolutely love it. As I always like to end our episodes, for the little shout out, who would you like to give a shout out to today?
Today I would like to give a shout out to Grant, Auntie Effie, because poor Grant's got a wee infection in his mouth. And he's suffering badly, darling, and tonight he's got to go and do the drag bingo, and he's really not feeling very well. So this one's for Grant F. Kid, aka Auntie Effie.
Oh,
I hope he feels better soon.
I hope you feel better soon too, Grant. Well, I'll have to give my shout out to Joy, who's a little under the weather, and we have a photo shoot tomorrow. So shout out to Joy. Feel better, please.
Joy and Grant feel better.
Absolutely, for both of you. So thank you very much, Judith.
Thank you, Michèle.
And this is Michèle at Jasami Bookworm Podcast. As always, wishing you a sunny day.